Good morning. Welcome to the Humanist community of Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney, and I am recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community. If you've not already joined, membership forms are available on our website at humanists.org. It's humanist plural. If you are listening for the first time, welcome. And we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events you can find listed on our website. Again, humanists.org. Please feel free to contribute to aid us in continuing to present these forums. You can donate to our organization on the website, again, humanists.org. Well, our speaker today is Professor Edward A. Lee. He's a professor of graduate school in electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley. He'll be discussing his new book, The Coevolution, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines. And that's pretty much all I have for an introduction, so take it away.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So I really appreciate the invitation to come do this, and I'm really thrilled to find out that the Humanist Society is actually continuing to do this every week, and that you're actually getting a really pretty good turnout. I had the pleasure of giving a talk when you were doing these as live events just last October, and I found it to be a really rewarding experience with a lot of really good interactions with people. And I'm thrilled that Alex and Matt invited me to come talk again when they found out that my book had finally come out with sort of the epitome of poor timing. It appeared right at the time that rumors were flying that Amazon was going to actually suspend shipments of everything non-essential, including books, which they deemed to be non-essential. And so I had a launch party for the book that consisted of exactly one participant, just me, and canceled quite a number of events that had been scheduled. So it's really nice to be here to, have a chance to talk about it. So let me, I'd like to share my screen, and I'll be showing some slides to sort of help things along and walk you through some of the topics in the book. And this is a little bit of an odd format for presenting, but I've found that on Zoom presentations, it actually works better to use the presentation mode of Zoom, of PowerPoint, and to adjust the video on my screen. And one consequence of this is that you will be able to see all of the speaker notes, which I think hopefully is harmless. And you also get to see what the next slide is that is on the slide deck. And those are just sort of side effects. But anyway, so, all right, getting started. The Coevolution. That's the title of this book. I could perhaps start by just explaining the significance of the graphic on the front, the egg with the circuit board inside. That was inspired by a famous quote of Richard Dawkins, who said that a chicken is an egg's way of making another egg. And the question that I raise and address in this book might be summarized as, is a human a computer's way of making another computer? The book is sort of a deep dive into the question about our relationship as humans with technology, and particularly digital technology and software. And the really short summary of the theme of the book is that we humans have less control than we think over technology development. This has some pretty profound implications, I think. It has implications to public policy. There's a lot of people who are calling for more regulation as we're seeing technology have an effect on democratic processes, and we're seeing privacy issues arising, and we're seeing a lot of people very worried about the future of work and how artificial intelligence is going to affect the future of work and so forth. And in my opinion, it's extremely difficult to come up with good policy if you don't really understand the processes that you're trying to regulate. I want to emphasize that my book is not a doomsday book. There's a lot of doomsday books out there that are talking about a runaway explosion of artificial intelligence and how humans are going to completely lose control. That's not what this book is about at all. I recommend if you're looking for a doomsday book, I suggest you go to some of these are really quite wonderful. One of the more recent ones, Human Compatible, by my colleague Stuart Russell at Berkeley, is a really wonderful read. But it's not really the topic of my book. My book is not, in fact, trying to predict the future at all. It's trying to look at the present. What is our relationship today with technology? So I'm going to try something that I haven't tried before when talking about this book, which is actually to use the structure of the book itself as a guide. And I'll go through each of the chapters and try to give you a sense of what the story is that the book tells. So the first chapter, the title of which is Half a Brain, introduces a metaphor of software-driven technological artifacts as being viewed as really living in a sense that they are that they're actually interacting with humans as if they were a new life form on our planet. So I call them living digital beings, which I shortened to the acronym LDBs, and that in my informal conversation, that became LDBs. I kept referring to them as just LDBs, and that sort of became a new word. I tried to use that word in the book, and the publisher eventually banished it. They thought that it was a silly word, and it would undermine the message of the book to be using a silly word to refer to these machines. But nevertheless, in informal conversation, I still tend to use that word. But this is a metaphor. It's a way of thinking about the relationship that we have with the machines. And one of my favorite living digital beings is Wikipedia. And this particular image that you see is actually a view of a server rack at one of Wikimedia Foundation's 5 data centers that serve up Wikipedia. And to me, it looks a little bit like looking into a living creature, although obviously it's made of silicon and wires. It's not a biological creature. But Wikipedia is, in many ways, does function like a living thing. It responds to its environment. Its environment is the internet. It responds to stimulus from that environment. And I'll talk in a little more detail about many other ways that it actually resembles living things. I do want to point out that I've made a commitment actually to, I will be donating all of the future royalties that I get from this book to the Wikimedia Foundation. So it's, in some ways it gives me an ability to not feel like a mercenary when I'm actually talking about promoting my book, because I won't be profiting from it in any way. And I like the idea of the royalties being used to support one of my favorite living digital beings. So it's not really, of course, directly supporting the living digital being, the software Wikipedia. It's actually supporting a community of humans at the Wikimedia Foundation. Those humans are themselves, of course, nurturing the machines and nurturing the software. But there's an interplay between the humans and the machines, because in some ways the machines and the software also nurture the humans, because they are, it is the machines and the software that end up bringing in the the capabilities, bringing in the donations that end up paying the salaries of the people. So this interplay of humans and technology is represented in a figure. The book has quite a number of pictures in it, but this is a device called a Kubi, which is actually, I would say, a now extinct living digital being, because it failed in the marketplace. So it did the product didn't manage to bring enough revenue to support the humans to nurture the machines. But it's really representative of this kind of interplay between machines and humans. And I think that in this pandemic era that we're living in right now, we're really getting a tremendously rapid evolution of this particular mechanism by which we're interacting with each other through the machines. The way this Kubi works is that you put your iPad on it, and then you can remotely, using a camera from another device, present your face and rotate the thing and sort of be a little bit more present in a room than you would be on a static screen. There's a lot more experimentation going on these days with our digital presence and our digital interaction between us and other humans around us. And my book is really very much about that. It's also very much about the way that technology changes. And one of the themes that runs throughout my book is to view technology as an evolution rather than as top-down intelligent design. Now, I've been working as an engineer for about 40 years, and I started writing embedded software in the 1970s. And I always thought of what I was doing as effectively top-down intelligent design, that the artifacts that I was creating were completely the product of my own creative mind. And it's embarrassing to me how long it took me to realize that that's really not the case, that everything that I produce is so enormously influenced by the technological context and culture within which I create it, that it's really not quite right to see it as the result of top-down intelligent design. So this picture, which is also in my book, is me standing in front of a ship that was commissioned by King Gustav II Adolf of Sweden and was launched in 1628. It was built as part of an effort, a war effort. Sweden was at war with Poland at the time, and Sweden had one of the most extensive navies at the time. And this boat was a pretty ambitious design, but it was a complete failure. When it was launched in 1628, on its maiden voyage, it had some 200 people on board celebrating the launch of this boat, and it made it about 1.5 kilometers off the dock, and then a slight breeze came up and it heeled over and it took on water and it sank to the bottom, killing 30 or so of the 200 people on board. There were 5 other similar boats that were in production at the time using the same design. And of course, it was a design flaw in this boat. And I'd like to give you an intuition that is, I think, very nicely reflected in this quote from the French philosopher Alain, whose real name was Émile Auguste Chartier. He said, "Every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It is clear that a very badly made boat will end up at the bottom after 1 or 2 voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others." So the insight there is that the boat designers are not, in fact, doing top-down intelligent design. They're more like an agent of mutation in a Darwinian process. They create a variant of an earlier design, and every piece of software that I've ever written is exactly that, a variant of an earlier design. And most of the software that I've written has died. It didn't survive in the competitive ecosystem in which I launched it. And it wasn't quite as dramatic a death as the death of this particular design of the boat, but it was properly viewed as the death of a mutation rather than a simply failed top-down intelligent design. So from this perspective, one might think that a software product like Snapchat is as much the product of teenagers as it is of the software designers who created it. So this perspective of technology as kind of a living, a family of living things, a whole ecosystem of living things, co-evolving with the humans, is really the theme that runs throughout my book. So in the second chapter, I address this question of, well, what really do we mean by life? And the goal here is not really to argue that really we should literally take software as a living thing, but rather that drawing the analogy with life can help us to understand our relationship with this technology in much more depth. So if you go to my favorite living digital thing and look up life on Wikipedia, at least at one time, I'm not sure today, I didn't check it, but Wikipedia pages change, of course, all the time. But at one time, there was an image like this that showed 7 requirements for what it meant to be alive. Now, of course, there's no agreement among biologists that these are the right 7 or anything like that, but I think they give us a useful guidepost for understanding in which of these properties are actually present in a software entity like Wikipedia. Well, I already mentioned it responds to its environment. That's a pretty straightforward observation about Wikipedia and many pieces of software. This requirement that it have cellular structure and composition, well, it certainly has that. The picture that I showed you earlier of the bank of servers and the data centers that are scattered around the globe give it a cellular structure. What about growth? Well, it certainly grows. In fact, Wikipedia was launched in 2001 on a single server, and that server no longer exists. It's true, actually, in the human body, the cells in your body, very few of them are the same cells that you were born with. Your cells are being constantly replaced, but the entity continues, and the entity lives through that replacement of the parts. And that has certainly happened with Wikipedia. It grew from one server to a very large number, a few hundred servers scattered around the globe. And during that growth, it continually responded to its environment with very few interruptions and only brief interruptions. And even those interruptions could be viewed as like treating a patient by putting them under anesthesia. So you cut off their interaction with the environment for a brief period of time. But the entity continues through that surgical process and through that anesthesia. Now, the other parts of the requirements for living are a little bit more of a stretch to draw an analogy, but homeostasis is actually a fairly easy one. That just says that the entity maintains stable inner conditions, and at a certain trivial level, that's true of the data centers. They have these computer-controlled air conditioning systems that regulate the temperature. The chips in the servers have regulatory systems that do voltage regulation to tolerate variabilities in the power supply, and so forth. So there's various homeostasis mechanisms that you can find. Metabolism is much more of a stretch, particularly if you define metabolism in biological terms. Then certainly Wikipedia doesn't have metabolism. But if you define metabolism as deriving energy from chemical reactions, and you think about where Wikipedia gets its energy, well, mostly it gets it from burning natural gas, because that's the predominant electric power generation mechanism, at least in the US. And so that is, in fact, deriving energy from chemical reactions. So it's not really a completely ridiculous analogy. Now, reproduction and heredity, to me, are actually the much more interesting properties. And the fact is that that technological artifacts do reproduce. Some of them actually autonomously. My book talks a bit about computer viruses and worms, which are able to reproduce kind of on their own. But most technological artifacts currently require a tremendous amount of help from humans to reproduce. Heredity, however, is really by far the most interesting one to me. And this is where, if we start to understand technology development as being less top-down intelligent design and more Darwinian evolution, heredity becomes a very central feature. Now, the fact is there are millions of juvenile wiki systems that are derived from Wikipedia. All the wiki systems on GitHub, for example, are enormously influenced and probably even have significant verbatim pieces of code that they share overlapped with Wikipedia. So there is a heredity mechanism where a piece of software does in fact show features that its antecedents had, and often actually includes code that its antecedents had, sometimes quite very literally. So at some level, Wikipedia has all 7 of these properties, and that means that drawing an analogy with living things is really not quite as far-fetched as it might otherwise be. Now, I'm not the first person to draw this analogy. In fact, I first learned about this way of thinking from Kevin Kelly, who was the founding executive editor for Wired magazine. And he wrote a book that's very much about this called What Technology Wants, and has given a TED Talk about it. And he introduced the term technium and called this the 7th kingdom of life. I guess some biologists have sort of come to a vague consensus that there are currently 6 kingdoms of biological life. And so he added a 7th. Kevin Kelly included in his technium rather static objects. So he talked about a musical instrument like a cornet being a living thing, or a hammer. To me, that's not quite right, because in order to be living, you have to be a process, not a thing. So to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Daniel Dennett, this is actually an indirect quote because it's Douglas Hofstadter, another one of my favorite philosophers, quoting Daniel Dennett, saying, "It ain't the meat, it's the motion," to emphasize that life is a process, not a thing. Douglas Hofstadter pointed out that this is a somewhat subtle hat tip to a somewhat unsubtle, clearly erotic song that was written in 1951. As a side note, I don't think it's quite accidental that Daniel Dennett cultivates this beard that makes him look an awful lot like Charles Darwin. This is a picture of Charles Darwin, and Daniel Dennett is tremendously an advocate of an evolutionary view of many things in our world. Now, I briefly mentioned viruses and worms, which are computer programs that are able to reproduce themselves. And here is a image that is showing a particular computer virus. It's a worm, the blaster worm. And these are the hex codes on the left, and the hex codes reinterpreted as ASCII. And you can see there's a message to Bill Gates embedded in the source code for this worm. In this chapter in my book, I actually look into the story about how computer viruses moved from being pranks to being crimes. In some sense, there was a growing up of computer science when computers became networked globally and much more open. And it became actually a criminal activity to introduce these things into the networks. And it hadn't always been like that. And of course, there's been a lot of activity in looking at computer programs that have the features, other features that whimsically imitate lifelike processes. So one of the more famous ones is John Horton Conway's Game of Life, a little snapshot of that is shown here on the right in the screen. And this is a really enthralling view of how rather simple little mechanisms can create very lifelike behaviors. As a side note, I might mention that John Horton Conway died very recently of COVID-19. So we're very sad to have lost him, of course, along with many other people who have been hit by this pandemic. Now, in this chapter, I also talk about Erwin Schrödinger, who is of quantum mechanics fame. And he wrote a very interesting book in 1944, which was about 10 years before the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, where his book is called What is Life? And Schrödinger was an expert in physics and pointed out that much of physics was based on statistical properties. Large numbers of random phenomena sort of aggregate to create statistical behaviors. And he pointed out that life can't be like that, that life has to actually emerge from not statistical, but rather specific mechanisms. Now, before people had an understanding of the double helix structure of DNA, he conjectured that the source of life was what he called an aperiodic crystal. And by this, he meant a stable molecule that would perform its actions not through statistical behaviors, but rather through precise reactions programmed into the structure of the molecule. This is very much like software. Software is not statistical in this sense either. Its behavior is dependent on every bit in the source code and in the object code. You flip one bit in a piece of code and the entire program can malfunction. And the same is true of DNA molecules. It's they're in this sense not very robust because permutations on them can have rather drastic changes in behavior, but they're also very stable and they're very digital. They can be copied perfectly. So this analogy between the structure of code and the structure of DNA is actually potentially quite useful in understanding this relationship and this analogy between technology and life. So this chapter also talks a bit about the origins of life, which are really rather poorly understood. There's a famous experiment done that dates back to 1934, the Miller-Urey experiment, where Stanley Miller showed that certain environmental phenomena that were, the environment that is our best understanding of what early Earth looked like was in fact able to produce amino acids, which were the basic building blocks of biological life. But there's a tremendous amount missing from the rest of the story, how amino acids become self-replicating molecules is not a well-understood process at all. But there's a lot of conjecture that the early forms of self-replicating molecules really wouldn't look much like modern life forms at all. And if we were able to look at those self-replicating molecules that were present in those early days, we would probably have a very lively debate about whether they were really alive or not alive. And, it's a debate that would be unresolvable, I think, much in the way that the debate about whether software systems are alive or not is kind of an unresolvable debate. So just to entice you to read the book and not just listen to me, there's also a cameo appearance in chapter 2 of Emily Dickinson, but you'll have to read the book to find out why she's in there. So in chapter 3, which is called Are Computers Useless?, I address the question, the perspective of technology as a cognitive prosthesis for humans. So the image on the screen shows a Sumerian tablet, which dates back to more than 2,000 years before the Christian era. And when these tablets were first discovered, of course, the notation, the language that was written on them was not understood at all. When the language was finally deciphered, it proved to be a profound disappointment to many people. People expected to find poetry or stories about early civilization, and that's not what they found at all. What they found were bookkeeping documents and records that were very bureaucratic. And in fact, arguably, I think Yuval Noah Harari in his recent book Homo Deus makes an incredibly good case that these tablets were compensating for the deficiencies of the human mind and the human brain. We're actually not very good at remembering numbers. We're not very good at remembering agreements that we've made. Writing these things down has become an absolutely essential extension of our minds. Working out things on pencil and paper, you can often work out much more complicated problems on pencil and paper, and the pencil and paper itself becomes part of your cognitive processes. And of course, today, with our smartphones and computers, these are becoming very much a part of our cognitive processes. They're not just external phenomena. They're processes that we integrate with our cognitive function. So in this chapter, I look at the question that, well, do these devices actually make us smarter or dumber? And this is a very controversial thing. In fact, I talk in this chapter about the Flynn effect, which is the phenomenon that IQ scores have been rising quite dramatically over the last 100 years or so. This is a measurable increase in that particular measurement of human intelligence. And there's lots of reasons why this much might have occurred. Some of the theories argue that it is because of technology. I'm not sure that I buy those, but I present some of that debate in this chapter. But one of the interesting things I learned in researching the book is that if you look on a bigger time scale, the last 10,000 years or so, it turns out that the average size of the human brain has decreased by about 10% in the last 10,000 years. And the only credible explanation that I have heard for that is that we've been able to offload some of our cognitive functions that are required for effective survival onto these intellectual prostheses, and it sort of alleviates the need for certain brain functions, and consequently we can get by with a smaller brain. So an interesting question that we might ask is, will the AIs that we're creating today, the artificial intelligences, become a cognitive prosthesis that actually integrates with our cognitive processes? That's possibly quite a different outcome from what the doomsday books that I mentioned before are talking about. Those books are talking about the AIs just stripping way ahead of humans and leaving us in the dust, and then taking over everything and leaving us out of the picture. But there's quite a different prospect, which is that they will actually become cognitive prostheses and become part of our own cognitive functions, and possibly even maybe cause our brain sizes to further decrease because maybe they will offload even more of our brain function over time. Who knows? But that's a wild speculation, and this book isn't about speculations about the future. It's really more about trying to understand the present. So in chapter 4, I address the question of what has the current revolution in AI, what is its significance, and how has it come about? Now, I think everyone agrees that the last 10 years have been a pretty remarkable time for artificial intelligence, and that a big part of the driving factors for that is the availability of huge amounts of data, and also the availability of effective, inexpensive computing. Those are very important. But one thing that many people don't seem to realize and bring quite to the foreground is that there's also been a very foundational change in the way that AI algorithms are constructed, that the way that AI software is constructed. And I point out in this chapter that the introduction of feedback is really at least from an algorithmic perspective, the key differentiator between modern AI, machine learning driven AI particularly, and the good old-fashioned AI that was much more algorithmic and procedural that led to systems like expert systems that I think were demonstrably less effective. This particular image is an image from that I got from just doing a search on Google for smiling cats. And the construction of such a collection of images can really only come from a rather sophisticated image analysis and image understanding engine. And I talk a bit in this chapter about how those engines work, but particularly on how they depend on feedback. And feedback, of course, can be layered. And one of the things that I point out here is that we can look at the layering of feedback and understand that nested levels of feedback give you significantly improved capabilities. Now, this particular image is from the Google Deep Dream project, where they turned around machine classification, image classification algorithms and tried to do image synthesis from them. So this is an image that was synthesized by an AI that was trained to recognize dogs. And so you could think of this as a synthetic image that this AI particularly resonates with as a dog-like image. And of course, to humans, this is not dog-like at all. This is, in fact, hugely bizarre. But this work stimulated a bunch of follow-on work on image synthesis that led to the development of a family of algorithms that are called generative adversarial networks, first developed by Ian Goodfellow. And what generative adversarial networks do is they overlay on top of the feedback mechanism in the basic machine learning algorithm another feedback mechanism where you have AIs playing off against one another. One AI trains another, and they're playing a game, an adversarial game, to learn from each other. So this kind of layered feedback takes you to a different level of sophistication from classical feedback systems. So this is a picture of a classical feedback control system. This is a World War II era anti-aircraft gun. Very sophisticated piece of hardware, no digital computers in it, but it's a feedback system that effectively solves differential equations in order to in order to predict the future location. In fact, what it does is it predicts the point at which an aircraft that is traveling in a certain way will, the path of the aircraft will intersect with the path of a projectile that is also traveling in a certain way. It makes a prediction that determines where that intersection of those two paths will occur, and then it figures out how to aim the gun in order to get the projectile to that intersection point at the right time. That was developed using feedback algorithms that were developed. One of the key contributors to that was Norbert Wiener, who was an MIT professor who coined the term cybernetics. So our cyber everything these days, that term actually comes from Norbert Wiener. And it's interesting that he played a central role in the development of these kinds of guns. But that was a simple feedback control system. It's one level of control. And many of the AI systems that we have still only have one level of control. And in my book, I talk about this wonderful game you can play if you have two of these smart home devices, where you can get them to have completely inane, totally repetitive conversations with one another, where they go on forever talking to each other, completely unaware that their conversation is completely inane and content-free. And this is an indicator of a missing layer in the feedback control that's being used in these AIs. So chapter 6 is a rather short chapter because it talks about the problem of explaining the behavior of AIs. It turns out to be rather difficult to explain why a classification algorithm based on deep learning comes up with the classifications that it does. And one of the things that I point out in this chapter is that it's actually the strength of these algorithms, that they do things that we can't explain. Because if we could explain the mechanisms by which a decision is reached, we could use much more algorithmic techniques instead of these deep learning techniques. And we would end up back in the days of expert systems, which are effectively algorithmic decision-making things where you do have an explanation of how they work. So on this question of whether we should be viewing digital technology as living, I wasn't content to just say, well, let's go with that analogy and run with it completely. I think there are very good counter-arguments. So Chapter 7 actually presents a counter-argument that we really shouldn't be taking that analogy of digital beings too literally. So this chapter is called The Wrong Stuff, and it draws very heavily on relatively recent work from psychology, which is the concept of embodied cognition, which says that the cognitive human mind is actually an interaction between the brain and the environment. It's not something that exists in the brain by itself. So to quote Esther Tellin, who was one of the pioneers of this way of thinking in psychology, she said the mind simply does not exist as something decoupled from the body and the environment in which it resides. So it turns out that there's quite a few people who have been exploring the use of robotics that is much more embodied. So this is a beautiful project that Josh Bongard was a leader on, to build robots that are not, in fact, programmed to learn to walk, but rather they explore their own bodies, their own machinery, in order to learn how to navigate. And these robots can even be modified. So if you take one of these robots and you pull off one of its legs, it will struggle for a while, but it will learn again to walk in the absence of that missing leg. So this exploration of embodied robotics, I think, is a very interesting development, because it really takes these machines out of the completely digital algorithmic world and much more into the physical world. And it's very suggestive that once you get embodied, where you're interacting with physical processes much more directly, that could lead to some pretty significant enhancements in the technology. Chapter 8 confronts this question directly about whether, in fact, we could reduce everything to digital algorithmic processes. And it addresses this question by asking the question of whether we, as human beings, are actually underlying everything, actually digital objects. Many people actually take for granted that we are, and that we just haven't reached the level of technology to enable us to understand how the human brain is a digital computer and how we can replicate the human brain in a digital computer. There are many people who believe that when the technology advances far enough, they will be able to upload their soul into a computer and become immortal. There are many people who believe that teleportation will eventually be possible, where you can take and encode a human being as a digital byte stream and transport it to somewhere else. So in this chapter, I really confront this question about whether we are in fact digital. And I actually make the case that the hypothesis that we are digital is actually a faith. It is not a scientific principle. It cannot, in fact, be proven by experiment. It cannot be disproven by experiment. And consequently, it really can only be taken on faith. And my argument actually depends on a key result from Claude Shannon, where Shannon showed in 1948 that a noisy channel cannot convey more than a finite number of bits. And as a result, it's, in fact, the hypothesis that we can be replicated by a digital algorithmic process is not falsifiable by experiment. Now, it turns out that this argument is actually a very, very subtle argument, and it relies on a fairly deep mathematical argumentation. And I didn't go through that mathematical argumentation in this book because it's not that kind of book. It would have They would have left people out. There's pointers in the book to where you can find the mathematical argumentation. But what I ask you to do in this book is just consider the possibility that human cognition is in fact not reducible to a Turing machine, that it's actually doing something that is well beyond what Turing machines are capable of. So Turing machines are capable of digital and algorithmic processes. Algorithmic processes, in an algorithmic process, everything occurs in a sequence of steps. And the stimulus and response from an algorithmic process is always a sequence of bits, and ultimately always a finite sequence of bits. And we really have no reason to believe that the physical world is limited to algorithmic and digital processes, and we have no reason to believe that cognitive processes are so limited. I have shown through these mathematical arguments that we have no way to prove that they are or they are not digital and algorithmic processes. But it really becomes ultimately then a matter of faith to believe that they are. Now, you might argue that, well, DNA is fundamentally a digital molecule. It has about 2 gigabytes of data, which is really not a lot of data by today's technology, a human DNA molecule. But I point out in the book that DNA is not a human. In fact, every human alive today is right now at the endpoint of a continuous, unbroken, analog biological process dating back billions of years. So the process that is me right now started 4 billion years ago as a biological process, and with no interruptions in those 4 billion years has led to a continuing biological process. And that continuing biological process carries a lot of information that is much more information than what is in the DNA. And biologists understand that inheritance is more than DNA these days. But how much of it is actually in that continuous biological process as opposed to in these, what Schrodinger called these aperiodic crystals, that's something that I think is not very well understood in biology these days. But nevertheless, the digital nature of DNA is not sufficient to prove that humans are in fact digital. So in chapter 9, I address this question of intelligences, and there's quite a few stories in there about experiments like Google's Duplex, which is a project that tries to give very human-like dialogue mechanisms. Lyrebird, which does voice cloning, so you can actually develop an AI that will imitate your voice and your speaking mannerisms. I really hope there's never an AI that replicates my speaking mannerisms, because I find my own speaking mannerisms kind of annoying. But nevertheless, there are AIs out there that can do this. So there's several stories here, but really one of the key points in this book is to take on some of the more extreme views around the singularity and around transhumanism, and to take on questions like the hard problem, which is David Chalmers' description of the problem of cognition, of consciousness, rather. So how is it that a brain develops a consciousness? Now, I don't have an answer for that. I don't think anybody has an answer for that. But I think it's very interesting to ask this question in a rather different way. What would it take to build a machine, particularly a digital computer that has consciousness? And I think there's a lot of insights that you can get about the question, even if you don't get any answers, by asking the question in the context of digital computers rather than humans. So in chapter 10, I look at the question of accountability. So when will we be able to hold all artificial intelligences accountable for their actions? I think this is an important question these days. We're talking about putting self-driving cars on the road. They're going to be capable of doing a tremendous amount of damage. So at what point are we going to be able to hold them accountable for their actions? So I start out this discussion by looking at a rather remarkable phenomenon, which is this portrait that's shown in front of a picture of Pierre Fautrel, who is an artist. And he took a program that was written by a teenager, Rabi Bharat, who is currently a student at Stanford. And Rabi's program was based on Ian Goodfellow's generative adversarial networks. So there's an inheritance chain for this program. And the Pierre and his colleagues with Obvious, there's 3 artists that were working together on this project. They used this program to create this painting, which then got sold at Christie's for $432,000. And there's an interesting question. I mean, they were presenting it as the first artwork created by an AI. So they were, in a way, my interpretation is their artwork is a piece of conceptual artwork, assigning accountability to an AI for the production of an artwork. And I think, to me, it's a very interesting thought experiment that it creates, and a very insightful thought experiment that you can form around this question of whether, in fact, AIs can or should be held accountable for their actions, and what does it take to hold them accountable for their actions. Can they be held accountable for inaction? So the fact that a modern car will happily slam into the rear end of the car in front of it, even if it's equipped with an adaptive cruise control system that is capable of detecting the fact that it is about to run into the car in front of it, right? Should we hold the AI or the living digital being in that car accountable for failing to act, as well as holding some system accountable for, in fact, acting? So these are interesting questions, and they inevitably lead to a very difficult question, which is, can AIs ever acquire something that resembles free will? And that's a gnarly question. And in this chapter 10, I relate a very fascinating debate between the philosophers Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett on this question of free will, and reinterpret their debate from the perspective of asking the question of whether AIs will ever be able to acquire something resembling free will. So I won't give you the punchline of that chapter. You have to read it. It's a rather nuanced question, and it's really more about clarifying questions than about giving answers. On this question of accountability, if we're going to hold anybody or anything accountable for its actions, a premise, a requirement, is that we have to have a notion that that entity actually caused the outcome that we're holding it accountable for. It turns out that this question of causation itself is a rather difficult question. So Bertrand Russell, rather famously in 1913, challenged the very notion of causation, saying that it actually has no basis in physics. He said, the law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone era, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. So that's a very colorful way of expressing of really launching a debate that continues in philosophy about whether the notion that action A causes action B is a human cognitive construction or something rooted in physics. So that informs the question of causality, especially when we're trying to talk about whether we can hold machines accountable for things they might cause. This changes the whole question into something that, by changing the question into something about machines, we actually can get a lot of insight into why this philosophical issue of whether causation is a physical phenomenon or a human mental construct, this ends up playing an enormous role in attempting to grapple with this question of whether we can hold machines accountable for their actions. So in this discussion of causation, I draw heavily on the work by a Turing Award winner, Judea Pearl, who has shown that reasoning about causation requires first-person subjective involvement. In fact, this issue of subjective involvement is anathema to at least to a classical view of science, which really requires that everything be objective. And if reasoning about causation requires subjectivity, and causation is central to your understanding of physics, how do you do science? You end up with a bit of an inconsistency there. And so this question comes to the foreground, particularly when we ask this question of whether machines will ever be able to develop a first-person subjective self. Until they develop that first-person subjective self, if you believe Judea Pearl's argument, they will never be able to reason about causation. So chapter 12 goes into quite a bit more depth about this, more depth probably than it should in a book like this. It ultimately draws on the work of another 3 Turing Award winners, Shafi Goldwasser, Silvio Micali, and Robin Milner, and draws the conclusion really that feedback, interaction, causation, free will, and accountability are all tied together in this enormous knot, that you can't address any one of these without addressing all the others. And that is, I think, again, in the spirit of not giving answers, it's an attempt to clarify the question of whether and how we should go about assigning accountability to machines. Now, why do we want to assign accountability to machines? Well, because the fact is that machines can do things that can be enormously damaging to humanity. So chapter 13 dives into detail about the pathologies that can emerge when we have globally networked systems. So this map is not a map of the progression of the coronavirus, although it has some interesting correlations with that. But this is actually the progression of the WannaCry ransomware, which is an internet worm that appeared in 2017. So in this chapter, I point out a few key points, which is that machines die. If we view them as living, should they have rights? Machines have pandemics. This WannaCry is a pandemic. I talk about a phenomenon that I call the information apocalypse, and I won't go into that here. You can read the book to find it. I talk a bit about surveillance economics and how this could be viewed as a pathological effect on human beings. And I talk about AI safety and how we can go about guiding the development of technologies in a way that benefits humans. My conclusion in this chapter is that in the partnership between humans and machines, that humans are actually the scarier part of that partnership. This is not the same conclusion that some of these doomsday books come to, but that is the conclusion that I come to. And you could say, well, all right, you could rest on the idea that, don't worry, we can always pull the plug on the machines if they start to do things that are too horrible. But can we really? What do you think would happen today if we shut down all the computers on the planet? I suspect that the effects on humanity would be pretty devastating. And so pulling the plug, I think we're past that point. We no longer have that option if we ever did. So the final chapter in the book ties all of this together under a view of the idea that humans are co-evolving with the technology, that human engineers are more agents of mutation in a Darwinian process. Now, in doing research for this book, I read this fantastic book by David Quammen called The Tangled Tree, and learned a lot about evolutionary biology and how it has evolved over time. I used to think that in biology, the way that evolution happened is that random mutations happen in a molecule like a DNA, for example, due to either chemical effects in the environment or cosmic rays that would cause a random permutation of some of the atoms in the DNA molecule, and that would lead to a mutation of a biological creature that was a mutant from its ancestors, and that some of those mutants would be favorably adapted to the environment and therefore would go on and produce more progeny that had that same mutation. But it turns out that view of biology doesn't actually work. It's unable, for example, to explain the rapidity of the the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So David Quammen's book explains very nicely for a non-biologist like me some of the things that biologists have discovered that makes biological evolution look a lot more like software development than it used to. One of the mechanisms, for example, is this mechanism that they call horizontal gene transfer, where a virus, which invades a bacterial cell and hijacks its DNA, its DNA mechanisms, can carry off a chunk of DNA and then deposit that chunk of DNA in another bacterium, creating a mutant of that bacterium. So by analogy, a software engineer who is pulling together pieces of code from GitHub, pieces of code from libraries like the standard template library or Python modules or JavaScript modules, getting coding hints from Stack Overflow, is this person really functioning more like a virus? The software engineer is taking a piece of code from here and a piece of code from there and stitching them together to create what I call a new codome. And that new codome is a mutant on its prior versions, and most of those mutations will prove unfit in the environment, but a few of them will survive. So this is what I mean by viewing software development more from an evolutionary perspective than top-down intelligent design. The other thing that I learned from Quammen's book was about this field of endosymbiosis that was really first brought to respectability by Lynn Margulis. And this is a theory that explains the development of eukaryotic cells, which are the cells, the human cells in our body, which are really distinctly different from bacterial cells because they have organelles, they have a nucleus, they have a mitochondria, etc. And in this theory of endosymbiosis, the way that these evolved was not by this random mutation, that suddenly a random mutation appeared that created a nucleus, but rather by the merging of simpler organisms. So one bacterium ingested another, and instead of digesting it, made it part of its metabolic system, and then figured out, the chemistry figured out a way to then replicate that dual construction of merged cells. And this, of course, can get much more elaborate and can help to explain the mechanisms by which multicellular organisms come about, where they come about first as colonies of single cellular organisms, and then those colonies start to acquire an entityness of their own. So this has a very strong analogy with technology development itself, and in fact, even goes further because it suggests the possibility that as humans are integrating technology much more into both our cognitive and our biological processes, that we will eventually become cyborgs where we really can't function without the technology. So one of the things that the doomsayers about AI talk about is the fact that computers will learn to write their own programs and they'll be able to program themselves and improve their own programs. One of the things that I point out in my book is that today computers teach humans to program. I write a lot of software and I get a tremendous amount of guidance from the software itself. When I use an integrated development environment like Eclipse, Eclipse is actually teaching me how to program. GitHub is teaching me how to program. Stack Overflow is teaching me how to program. Some relatively recent developments like Jupyter are phenomenal at teaching humans to program. And they teach humans to program the programs that then teach humans to program. So there's this tremendous feedback loop that happens. So I think that that's a much more interesting development than the one about the machines running off on their own and leaving the humans in the dust as separate and irrelevant operators. So what is the human role in technology development? Well, we may not like seeing our mental cognitive processes as cogs in a relentless, purposeless evolution, but maybe that's what they are. And I put my previous view, my old-fashioned view, the top-down intelligent design view, I call that digital creationism. And I think that it really doesn't hold water for me anymore. There are implications for policy. So think about this. right? Think about, for example, privacy laws. Why are privacy laws so ineffective? Well, under digital creationism, bad outcomes are the result of unethical actions by individuals. For example, people who blindly follow the profit motive with no concern for the societal effects. Under coevolution, though, bad outcomes are the result of procreative prowess. Technologies that succeed are those that more effectively propagate. And that's a different mechanism, and it suggests that the policies should be different to address that mechanism. So the conclusion is really that we humans nudge rather than control technology development. We change as technology changes. The technology changes the humans, and then the humans change the technology. So this is a coevolutionary process, and only if we develop a deeper understanding of that coevolutionary process do we have a hope of developing effective policies that ensure that technology serves humanity. So thank you very much. With that, I would like to open up for questions.
Just talk. You don't have to get up there.
My name is Roy Elder, and I retired as a software engineer, and I think I consider myself as an elder bee. So if that makes sense. But, excuse me. Anyway, I got my master's in cybernetics, and I welcome you aboard as a cybernetician. And by the way, I did, in 1948 at UCLA, heard Norbert Wiener speak about feedback. So I feel really blessed. And he became part of my profession. And so anyway, I do have one thing about this COVID that I think it may be a paradigm shift. I had a virus disease in my arm one time, and they used high intensity
UV light, maybe?
Yeah, they used a high intensity ultrasound. And I thought, I've been looking at that, and I cannot find any connection between ultrasound, high intensity. So I use low intensity for diagnosis, but I don't see any high intensity for treatment or anything like that. So I'm still looking, and I'm just waiting for something to appear. So what do you think?
Well, I'm not a biologist, and so I really have no clue about that. I've never heard of ultrasound being used as a treatment in that way.
It's been used as cancer treatment. Yeah, it's been used as a cancer treatment, and also the meat industry has used high energy. Intensity to treat non-invasive microbes, and obviously one of the microbes is a virus. So I'm going to stay tuned on this, and I'll do some more research.
I've certainly heard of the use of ultraviolet light for that purpose, but not sound. I've never heard of the use of sound for that purpose, but I'm not an expert at all. Okay.
Hi. I'm also a software engineer, so I can relate to a lot of what you described. And I think that this idea of coevolution is a very fruitful perspective on what is going on. And it may have big implications for policy, because usually when we are developing any policy, any regulations, they are based on our ability to predict what would happen in this or that case. But if we are ourselves as humans a part of this coevolution process, and we apparently cannot predict all these different implications of our actions and simply what is going on with this evolution. So how can we develop any meaningful policy, and how can we prevent maybe very undesirable outcomes. So I understand that your book is not a doomsday book, but still you probably somehow try to address this question. So
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, one of the things about coevolutionary processes is that they are nonlinear feedback loops, which tend to be chaotic. And chaos here, I use that in the technical sense, which is that arbitrarily small permutations can have arbitrarily big effects in the future.
Yeah.
And so chaotic systems are inherently unpredictable. And there's no amount of understanding of the system that makes it predictable, actually. You can have a perfect understanding of a system and it's still not predictable if it's chaotic. What you have to do in such cases is feedback control. You have to be continuously regulating. So you can't establish policies now and then treat them as fixed into the future in order to expect reasonable outcomes from a chaotic process. You have to keep adjusting your policies. So this is one of the examples. This is an example of one of the things that I'm advocating in this book, is that if we understand the processes better, we can have a more realistic expectation of how to go about, nudging them, controlling them, constraining them. It's about nudging and regulating and constraining, not about designing the future.
So does it imply that we have to change our whole approach to policy making and even to governance as a whole, because we need to make it much more agile and responsive
and much more adaptive? Much more adaptive. Yeah. Right now, every time we introduce a privacy law, it takes a few weeks or months before everyone's worked around it. And the law just then, stays fixed for years, decades. And, all those privacy policies that we all get, that we have to click through and everyone knows it's pointless, are a reflection of an approach to policy that is clearly not working.
Thank you.
Edward Salas.
Yes.
My understanding of this might be a little simplified, but when you talk about the interface of the dangers of AI, I keep thinking, as people, as organic beings, we're full of all kinds of motivations. But my understanding is that the AI, the program, the machine, whatever, we're still in a position to define what it's trying to do. Is that correct? I mean, it might be that if we told it we would like to increase the environmental protection for penguins or something, that might have an adverse effect on humanity. But I think we could watch out for that. I'm just wondering what your feeling about that is. Do we still have some control, at least to that degree, that we tell it what it's trying to do?
I think for that question, I would refer you to my colleague Stuart Russell and his book Human Compatible, which is really all about that. It's about how you set the goals that an AI system would have in a way that would ensure that the behavior of that AI remains compatible with the interests of humanity. And he points out in that book that it's an extremely difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I suspect it's hard just to define humanity. Yes,
absolutely. In his book, I mean, he addresses even if you have, you don't consider a societal system, just a single individual, and you try to design AIs that are conformant with the goals of that single individual, even that is incredibly difficult. And it gets, of course, vastly harder when you have when you have to address the conflicting goals of many individuals.
It's hard to understand our own goals sometimes.
That's right. So Stuart's book is a really wonderful read about that topic, and he addresses it in much more depth than I do in my book.
Thank you.
Yes, Warren. Let's see. I have to find you on the list. You can actually, I changed it so you can unmute yourself, but I'll unmute you.
Good, thank you. All right. I just had a comment about your comment about some people put together a computer program that made a piece of artwork and was shown somewhere. But it reminded me of the other aspect of humans of deciding what the hell is worthwhile and valuable. A man for 15 or 18 years took cheap wines and mixed 3 or 4 or 5 of them together and put them in a bottle with a fake label that said the wine was 70 years old. And many people were willing to pay $8,000, $10,000, and $12,000 for one bottle of wine, which really wasn't what the hell they thought it was. And so fraud is a very difficult thing. Why do we decide that something is really valuable and something is not?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I actually just, I discussed that question to some degree in sort of grappling with the question of what exactly was the artwork that was sold for $430,000, right? And my claim in the book is that it's not the painting. That's not what the buyer paid $430,000 for.
What's the buyer saw?
Paid the money for was the concept.
Yeah.
Okay. It was a piece of conceptual art. And it's an interesting one because it's one that you can really only do once. It's the first AI created artwork, right? You can't have 2 first created AI created artworks.
Right. The second one ain't worth as much as the first one, right?
Exactly. So in that sense, there was a lot of debate, it turns out, in the online forums about whether the artists were being horribly unfair to the writer of the software, right? Bharat, right? They basically used his software with almost no changes. And so if it was the AI who created it, why shouldn't he get the $430,000 rather than them?
Right.
These are questions in part about the art marketplace and the world of art and what it means to be an artwork. And, these are very human questions. And but they're interesting questions. So, good question. So Ray, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm Ray Sudby. Thanks for your talk, Edward. I'm an automation controls engineer and found it interesting when you were talking about the differences between observation and interaction and talking about feedback loops. And it seems to me that observation, you're trying to see what's going on without changing it or making your observation change what you're seeing, whereas interaction is partly observation, but also interacting with whatever it is you're involved with so that you may change it.
Yeah.
I'd like you to comment about that a little bit.
Yeah. So you might resonate with a little story that I tell in the book about how a sense of self, like we all have, could come about in biology, and how a sense of self is actually ranges from something very primitive to something very sophisticated. And I talk about the nervous system of a worm that has only less than 200 neurons, and yet this nervous system is able to distinguish self from non-self, in the sense that the worm has sensors that will detect motion in the surface under it. But the worm reacts differently if the motion is caused by its own neural efferents than the motion being caused by some external event. So this nervous system is able to distinguish self from non-self because it is a system that is interacting with its environment, and it's this feedback loop that enables that separation of self from non-self. So, in a sense, you could think of this as a basic building block for much more sophisticated cognitive systems. And I point out in the book that a lot of software already has this capability. So Facebook, for example, runs algorithms that will automatically permute various aspects of the user interface and then run a controlled experiment to see whether people, click on more ads with this interface versus this interface, and then evolve the software to, get people to click on more ads. This is a mechanism that is actually not that dissimilar, because it is, in fact, trying to make a distinction between effects in the environment that were caused by the action of the software itself as opposed to caused by some environmental effect. So it's a very deep question, and it's one that I go into in probably more depth than I really should have in the book.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up. So what I started out doing is working with controlling basically discrete inputs and outputs. Limit switch turns on and you start a motor or something like that. And that evolved to analog inputs, PID loops, and then machine vision, where you can look at something and analyze the image and make a robot move in a certain direction based on what it, quote unquote, sees from that camera. And of course now software, computers, control systems are way beyond all that. But there still seems to be a pretty good market for just the basic things that I've always done.
There is. One of the interesting things, I was speaking to one of my colleagues who is a control systems expert, who has worked for many years on very, very sophisticated mathematical algorithms for model predictive control and so on. And he was lamenting the fact that a lot of the sophisticated techniques that he teaches in his courses are being outperformed by AIs that are trained using deep learning. And, to him, this is just a horrifying development, because all that sophistication, it seems, is going out the window. I don't know that it's really that dire. I think there is still a role for, sophisticated designed feedback control as opposed to learned algorithms, but we're going to see much more of a mix of those kinds of technologies in the future.
So I kind of always subscribe to the KISS principle, keep it simple.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, the simpler you can make something, the better it works.
Absolutely.
The more reliable it will be.
And I also wanted to support this idea that all these advancements recent advancements in artificial intelligence, they are just based on combination of ideas that were known for decades. So the idea of feedback control is very old. Yeah. The idea of deep learning, this networks, perceptron was invented about 50s or 60s, and there were already at that time these experiments with adding another intermediate layer, so it's also pretty old. And the genetic algorithms also were known for maybe 30 years or something. So it's all just clever combinations of well-known ideas that plus big data, plus this more powerful hardware that enabled all this progress. And that's pretty scary if you think about it, because it means that something completely unexpected and powerful can happen in this area if some really new ideas or new combinations of old ideas will be tried, and it will come as a surprise.
Yeah, I think your observations underscore this idea that the technology is evolving. And in fact, I go through some of that history. I talk in the book about Harold Black at Bell Labs in the 1920s, who invented the basic feedback control mechanism that was the foundation of classical control theory. And I talk about the fact that the backpropagation algorithm that's used in deep learning was first used it was used literally by rocket scientists in the late 1950s who were trying to figure out, trajectories for re-entry vehicles, and were trying to figure out how to steer solar sails to be able to get a spacecraft to Mars. And they actually developed the backpropagation algorithm, which is now the core algorithm behind deep learning. So the history is always more complex than we realize when we identify these heroes as inventors and say, this person created this whole new concept. Well, it never really comes about quite so simply.
A good example of feedback and also keeping it simple comes about in trees, which can't run away like a deer can thing, but on a leaf, when a beetle begins to chew on it, that leaf will produce some chemicals which are either bitter or toxic, and the beetle goes away. And so the tree, although he stays in the same place for 100 years, has managed to survive very well using feedback and simple examples.
Yeah. Another example that I talk about in my book about feedback in biological systems, a naive understanding of DNA is that it's a blueprint for the human body, but it's not, right? There's actually not enough information in DNA. It's only 2 gigabytes of data. That's not a whole lot of data. And people have discovered, for example, that the shape of joints is developed during the development of a fetus. And when the fetus is kicking in the womb, that's an essential part of the development process. People have done what I consider horrific experiments with animals where they restrict the motion of the fetus and the joints end up horribly deformed. So the structure of the joints is not defined by the DNA. The phenomenon of doing the kicking to adjust the growth is defined by the DNA.
So what do we do when the robots take over and we don't have any jobs and everything goes away? What are your thoughts on that? Like what happens then?
Well, one of the things that I think that we are learning with this pandemic is how to survive with a much, much smaller workforce, right? That's not an experiment I think any of us wanted to try to find out what was going to happen when, we would perhaps eventually end up with a much, much smaller workforce just because we don't need people anymore. But we're finding out now what happens with a smaller workforce and what we can do and what we can't do. But I guess for that question, I would recommend Martin Ford's book, which is called The Rise of the Robots, I think that's the title. He has, I think, a very nuanced look at that question and very thoughtful. It is very much a doomsday book. His picture is, his conclusion is that we are doomed. And one of his key points, I think, is that we're going to have to learn to change a lot of societal structures to prevent, massive starvation, for example, and overwhelming poverty as a consequence. So, but I don't really talk about that in my book because I was trying to steer clear of too much prediction about the future and try to understand more of the mechanisms and how they work today.
Yeah, I understand that. But I want to point out, yeah, we had like a big drop because of the virus and the workforce, but it's only like 25-30% of the workforce.
It's true.
And, you know, with the coming of automation and AI, it's going to be more like 90% of the workforce is going to be automated away. Now, it's going to take a long time for that to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, but
I don't think it's obvious that it will play out that way. I think that,
okay.
In fact, I think if you think of it from a coevolutionary perspective, if the robots and the AIs become cognitive prosthesis as opposed to replacements, that means that we're going to be doing things very differently. But who knows what they're going to be, right? And it's not immediately obvious to me that that's going to result in most humans being completely inactive. It may have very different effects.
Right. True.
I think that once we get to the point where automation is providing for our basic needs and also our desires for entertainment and recreation, it will free people to pursue things they're interested in. When you don't have to go to work every day to earn a living, I don't think you'll sit idle. I think that you'll still be productive, but in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, that's one possible outcome. You know, we could end up developing an economic system that pays people to be like professors. I consider myself a professional student, right? And I'm extremely lucky to have a job that pays me to be a professional student. Imagine, you know, if we had an economic system where many more people could be professional students. That would be fantastic, I think. It's really a nice lifestyle to be a professional student.
In some ways, that's the position I have where I'm working now. I'm kind of, to a certain extent, left to follow my own guidance and develop things that the company needs.
Yeah, that's a nice position.
I've always enjoyed my work.
Yes.
I'll just throw out one point. You showed cuneiform tablets, and you pointed out that they're mostly tax collectors kind of things, and that was true of the year. But I also want to point out that 2,700 years before the Christian era, a bunch of those cuneiform tablets had the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a wonderful story, and there were a few poems in there.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
Can you speak up a little bit? Do you have to recognize me? Yes, I think I have my hand up, but maybe I'm supposed to speak up by myself. Things that Ray just said and the last few people said pretty much what I wanted to say. I know in Alaska, for instance, they distribute the profits that the government got from the oil to the people. I would think things like a basic annual income and so forth would free us up to pursue, as you said, our own interests. And it all comes down to the political will, which is a shaky structure to pin it on, but we could hopefully come to that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Norway is another example of that, where they, distribute the wealth from their natural resources very equitably and create what I consider to be a really wonderful society.
What you were saying in your talk about how basically legislation always trails dramatically behind the technology, though, kind of scares me in this sort of realm. It leads me to believe there would be a rather large gap between when the AI comes in and when policy is appropriate for the new technological like world that we live in. And like you were saying in your talk earlier, that seems to be the case. You'd mentioned about privacy regulations and how as soon as the privacy regulation comes out, they get around it, and then it, 5 or 10 years later, maybe legislation will catch up with the ways in which our privacy are being invaded. I don't know if that's really a question, but I just noticed that in your talk you had mentioned that. So that was kind of all I had to say here.
Thank you.